It's a pleasure to be back in Seattle. It's a pleasure to be back at Town Hall. I love this place. I love the city. It's a great city. This is a great venue. And what we're and the staff do here at Town Hall Seattle is phenomenal. It's so important for us all to have a chance to get together and talk about the issues that are so important to all of us. And one of the great things about Seattle is it fosters that kind of community communication. It's been quite a day. Here we are on May Day in Seattle, and Seattle is vibrant, full of demonstrations, paying with its fist in the air to Donald Trump's 100 days and saying, we're in a different part of the country. We're the other Washington. If there are alternative facts, there are alternative places in the country, right? But I want to talk with you tonight, hope you join me in the conversation about the state of our democracy. And I say that very particularly, our democracy. Not our government, not our administration. We're very much caught up in the media and in our public dialogue in thinking about, talking about what Donald Trump is doing in the presidency, how he got to the presidency. I'll get into that in a little bit, and whether or not we're for or against Donald Trump. And I really want to get beyond that subject because our democracy is in trouble in a much more fundamental way, and it has been for quite a while. It is not the result of the last election. In some ways, Donald Trump's presidency is a symptom of where our democracy has come, as well as a potential problem for where it goes, and opportunity in the eyes of some other people. But we really need to get back and think about some fundamentals. So I want to talk to you for a moment about the election of, or take an adventure with you, looking at the election of 2016 as an MRI in America. Instead of looking at the tactics and the strategies of the campaigns and the candidates, let's look at it from above and see what it tells us about the state of the country at the point the country went to the polls. I don't mean to the polls in November. I mean, we started going to the polls, remember, in January. Went all through the whole year. And we talk about the election of 2016, we're not just talking about the general election, Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton. We're talking about 3 elections. We're talking about the election in the Democratic Party that picked the nominee, the election in the Republican Party that picked the nominee, and then the general election. And what's striking to me as a longtime reporter in Washington, having covered a whole bunch of elections, is that this election was very different from other elections that we've had in recent years or recent decades. Typically, American elections are fought on a horizontal plane, horizontal axis, right against left, liberal against conservative, blue against red. This election was fought on a vertical axis. This was an election of a revolt, a mutiny from below against the establishment up above in both parties. It's very important to think about that. I mean, we've taken it for granted, we sort of absorbed it, but we've forgotten it. We had that 73-year-old Democratic socialist from a state that is not known for a very heavy electoral college count, Vermont, right? Bernie Sanders. He starts from nowhere. The media doesn't take him seriously. Other politicians don't take him seriously. Certainly the Clinton campaign didn't take him seriously. And what does he do? He runs across the country and he carries 21 states and he wins 14 million votes. And he nearly knocks off someone who was assumed by everybody to simply be going through the political coronation. And what that tells us was that Bernie Sanders was able to tap into something very deep, very fundamental, very emotional, and very alive, and full of the kindling of fire in the belly of America. He talked revolution. He's got a post-election organization, and it's called Our Revolution, right? He was talking about the inequality of income. He was talking about the power of Wall Street. He was talking about Hillary Clinton making $600,000 speaking fees from Goldman Sachs. He was talking about a political system that was dominated by mega money and dark money, by gerrymandering, by special interests, and it resonated. It resonated because people felt that way, and he gave voice to the frustrations and the anger deep in the belly of this country. That's why he came so close. So what that says is to the left of center and left, there was this passion, this anger, this division within the Democratic Party. And then on the other side, we have a total political neophyte. We have occasionally had that in our past, generals, Ulysses Grant, Dwight Eisenhower. No political experience, running against a bunch of establishment candidates who'd been senators and governors in the Republican Party. Nobody takes him seriously. He proceeds to offend just about every electorate that you can imagine, every constituency you can imagine. He's a misogynist, he's against Mexican Americans, he's against Muslims, he's a predator. He does everything that you could imagine a candidate could do wrong, and he wins. Now, what you say to that is it's outrageous, it's terrible, it shouldn't happen. But as a political observer and as an analyst, as a reporter, I have to say, how does it happen? How does the hummingbird fly? How does the bee stay aloft? And how does Donald Trump win? And what does that tell us about America? He's the only one of the candidates on the Republican side who said that trade agreements had cost us millions of middle-class jobs. He was the only one on the Republican side who said that we've been run by an establishment, even in our party, that's leaving behind millions of middle-class Americans. He said, I'm going to stand behind Social Security and Medicare, when most of the Republican candidates were saying, you know, we've got to privatize, or we've got to change these fundamental protectors of the safety and security and the benefits of the middle class in this country. And he said, believe it or not, I don't know if you know anything about what the H-1B program is, but the H-1B is a visa program that brings into this country, allows high-tech companies like Microsoft and Apple and Google and Oracle, and you name them down the line, and banks in New York, J.P. Morgan, the rest of them, Citibank, to import college-educated foreigners to take jobs in American companies making 1/3, 1/2, 1/4, well below average American salaries. These are knowledge economy jobs. This has been going on since 1990. It's not supposed to be that they can fire Americans and cause them to require them to retrain, to train their own replacements. But that's been going on. Trump was the only Republican candidate who even mentioned that that was going on. Now that may have gone by you while he was doing a whole lot of other outrageous things. But it resonated with a whole lot of people on the other side. And so you have another candidate on the Republican side who is tapping into that same sense of anger, frustration, and being left behind that Bernie Sanders was tapping into on the Democratic side. So in both parties, you have this vertical battle, the middle against the top, the people against the establishment, the forgotten against the fortunate, the worried against the wealthy. That's what's going on. That's what the election of 2016 was about. And when we get into the final general election, Trump manages to label Hillary just enough as being the voice of Goldman Sachs. And she and the Democratic Party establishment, the Democratic Party strategists, fail to recognize that this is a serious grievance in the body politic. Yes, there are all kinds of things you can say. What Comey said and did about the investigation of Hillary's emails and what he didn't say about Trump's, and what the media covered and didn't cover in her emails and so on. Yes, those had effects. But when you look at the loss of states like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan, and you look at what the turnout was, when you look at who didn't turn out, in a place like Milwaukee County. Milwaukee County is a heavily Democratic area. Large percentages of blacks, Hispanics, and poor whites. The turnout in Milwaukee County was 60,000 lower in 2016 than in 2012. A whole lot of Democrats didn't bother to go out to vote. And my contention would be they did not feel a connection with Hillary Clinton. And I don't think it was about personality. I think it was about the issue of being economically forgotten. And telling them, I have a plan to do X, Y, or Z. was not connecting with them in the same way as a guy who railed against the trade agreements. By the way, trade agreements that good economists tell us actually cost us the export of 5 million American jobs, either through NAFTA, through the accession of China to the World Trade Organization and most favored nation treatment by the United States, through the Korean Trade Agreement and the Central American Trade Agreement, negotiated by both Republican and Democratic presidents. So these guys, Sanders and Trump, were tapping into something very fundamental that was going on in America that none of the other people running against them really got in the same way. Whatever they said, they were putting out pro forma, and it didn't connect. So we've just had a very profound election that's shaken up the politics of this country, and we're really not sure where it's going. Now we've got somebody in the White House who is thrashing around one way or another with most of the time what I would call the illusion of action, not action itself. When you sign 29 executive orders, half of which call for studies, reports, panels, somebody's going to report in 6 months or in a year, you're not actually taking action, but it looks like action, and it feels good to the people who supported him. But the rest of folks are running around worrying considerably with good reason. What's going to happen to the environment, what's going to happen to workers' benefits, what's going to happen to all kinds of issues that are important. And so we have now a new burst of civic activism in this country. We have a new reaction of resistance to Trump, an activation. You had demonstrations here today and probably in lots of other cities in the country on both sides, pro-Trump and anti-Trump. So we're now, in many ways, a more activated country, a more activated citizenry than we've been for a long time during a non-campaign period. And that can be either good or bad. I see a lot of good potential in that, as well as some downsides. But the downside risk to our democracy is considerable. It's considerable because the economic discontent and the economic dislocation is so profound. We are a deeply divided country. And most of the time when the press talks about a deeply divided country, they're talking Republicans, Democrats, they're talking red, blue, they're talking hyperpartisanship. And it's there. But the far more profound and far more important division in this country is economic. We're divided by money. And money gets translated in power, and those millions start rolling into the campaigns in the hundreds of millions, and then into the billions. And they've been skyrocketing. We all know that. We're divided by money, we're divided by power, and we're divided by something I've tried to put a label on, but I call it economic destiny. It isn't just where you are. It's where you are relative to where you were and where you expect to be. A lot of people call it opportunity. I think for a lot of folks, it's not opportunity. It's the lack of opportunity. But what they see it, and if you look at the voting, by the way, in 2016, what's interesting is Hillary Clinton actually carried the poorest people in this country. If you look at the economics of the voting record of the people whose family incomes are below $50,000 a year, Hillary Clinton carried them by about 10%. But from $50,000 to $110,000 or $120,000, Donald Trump won by 10%, excuse me. This is the middle class. You'd think they were fairly well off. Well, they are, but they're downwardly mobile. They're economically anxious. These are people who feel forgotten, who feel worried, who feel unable to secure their own future, their own retirement, and particularly worried that they can't deliver for their children what they hoped to and what they felt their parents delivered for them. This is a critical body of people in this country, and they've lost faith in the system. They've lost faith in the leadership. They've lost faith in conventional politics. And they're thrashing around looking for anybody who's different and who can fix things. One of the most interesting pieces of information to me about the last election in terms of looking at numbers is to look at 20 or 25 rural small-town counties in the state of Wisconsin. Now, these counties went heavily for Obama in 2008 and 2012, and they went for Trump. You've been told that. But they also went, in state elections, they went for Scott Walker, Republican, hardline, right-wing, pro-business, anti-union, anti-benefit Republican governor of the state of Wisconsin. And they also voted for Tammy Baldwin, a liberal, lesbian Democratic senator. What that says to me is those voters don't have any idea who they're voting for. They just want to vote for somebody different. Obama promised change, Trump promised change. Walker promised change, Baldwin promised change. What they're saying is conventional politics don't work. And I think that tells you that's part of this MRI about America that I'm trying to share with you. Now, what's interesting is that sometimes that's very hard to fathom and to figure out. And it was certainly a dilemma for both President Obama and certainly Hillary Clinton running. Because if you look at the macroeconomics of America going into the 2016 election, the macroeconomics look good. 72 months of growth. The unemployment rate has come down from 10% to under 5%. In 2015, the median wage in America went up 2%, 2.9%, and in 2016 it went up 2%. So that looks good. And you would have thought that was a good, positive record to run on. But the microeconomics, not the macroeconomics looking at the nation as a whole, but the microeconomics seen from the perspective of the family look terrible. If you were in the median family in America, or tens of millions of median families, people whose household income was somewhere between 40 and 75 or 80,000 a year, your income was lower in 2016 than it was in 2007, before the economic downturn. It was lower than it was in 1999. Now think about what that means. If the median household income is lower in 2016 than in 1999 for these median families, these middle families, that means for tens of millions of people, the American economy is actually going backwards for 17 or 18 years. That's what we're talking about. That is an experience that most of us in this room, certainly I, can't claim to have any real personal knowledge of or feel for. I try to understand it, I try to report it, I try to listen to people, but I can't live it. It's not where I live. And I think that's one of the problems with the people who are making decisions in the Democratic Party. Now you can say Trump was totally cynical about it, he spotted it, he realized, he saw that was a vulnerable spot, and he exploited it. But the point was he did give voice to that discontent. The other point is that discontent remains with us today. It has not been dealt with. And it is even worse today because, as you probably noticed if you read the papers over the last few days, the growth rate in the first quarter of 2017 was, 0.7%, as opposed to 2.5% at the end of 2016. Now, whether that will continue or not, we don't know. But consumer buying, which is really the driving force of the American economy. People talk about the job creators all the time, as if the job creators were on Wall Street, as if the job creators were the top 1%. No, ladies and gentlemen, the job creators in America are sitting in this room. It is you, it is us, it is American consumers. The secret to the great American growth period from the end of World War II to the end of the 1970s was that prosperity was shared. Big business leaders thought it was good business and smart economics to pay tens of millions of Americans well, because American workers go out and spend what they earn, 95% of what they earn in good times and 105% of what they earn in bad times. And that's what drove the American economy. And if the wealth isn't adequately shared, our growth slows down. There's a huge secret that at the moment isn't even being discussed while Trump's tax plan is being discussed. This enormous bonus that he wants, the bonanza he wants to give the rich. It is utter malarkey what is being said, not only by the president, but by most press people who are analyzing it. It is not true that cutting taxes causes growth. The period when we had the highest taxes in America, Dwight Eisenhower in the 1950s, the top marginal tax rate, the tax rate on the top people, was 92%. It dropped down to 77% under John F. Kennedy in the 1960s. And during those 2 decades, the average growth of the American economy was a little bit over 3%. Fast forward to the early 2000s. Under both George W. Bush, the Republican, and Barack Obama, the Democrat, the maximum marginal tax rate was down to 35%, okay? So you would have thought we'd been growing 3 times as fast. The average growth rate, even before the economic downturn of 2008, was a little over 1%. There is no connection whatsoever. And research by the Congressional Research Service, as well as by good economists like Joe Stiglitz, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics at Columbia University, or Paul Krugman at Princeton, or a number of others, shows absolutely clearly that high inequality of income is bad for growth. And that if you bring the income levels at the bottom and the top closer together, as, by the way, you've tried to do by raising the minimum wage here in Seattle, you actually get faster growth over a long period of time. So that's not what we did. We went the other direction. So we have this high inequality, and inequality was the gut issue of the 2016 election. It's what lay behind it. It's what drove the vote. It's what determined the challenge, and actually, in the end, determined the winners in the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. Well, not the Democratic Party, in the Republican Party and in the general election. So we have this divide that is troubling us. And then the difficulty is that that divide then goes and spills over into our political system. We have this hyper-concentration of wealth. By the way, it's almost impossible to believe. I don't know if what your reaction was. When I first heard the slogan, the 99% and the 1%, and saw the bumper stickers of Occupy Wall Street, I thought, that is really a clever bumper sticker. That is really a clever slogan. But it's not accurate. I mean, isn't the 99% and the 1%? Well, I found out later. I read some economic stuff. There's a very good Princeton economist whose name is slipping my mind at the moment. Alan Kruger is his name. He reported, based on some economic research done by people at UC Berkeley and actually at the Sorbonne in Paris and elsewhere, 84% of the entire nation's growth in income from 1979 to 2012 went to the top 1%. 84% of, I'm saying it twice because you really have to hear it twice to even begin to absorb it. When I read this figure, I just couldn't believe it. 84% went to the top 1% over 32 years. You do the arithmetic quickly, if they got 84%, that means all the rest of us, the other 99%, got 16% of the nation's growth. That means over 3 decades, the top 1% got 5 times as much of the nation's growth in income as the entire rest of the country. So the 99% and the 1% bumper sticker is absolutely right. It's not a slogan. It's not empty words. It is reality. And that reality is sitting there aching this country today. And unless we can find a way to deal with that issue, I think it is going to ache with us the same way that slavery ached with America in the mid-19th century. This is a deep, deep cleavage. When I went to Oxford after finishing Williams, one of the things I did was to read some of the work of Arnold Toynbee, the great British historian, who wrote a study called A Study of History. He studied 21 human civilizations over 6,000 years to understand how they rose and how they fell. I want to admit to you right now, I did not read all 12 volumes. But I did read Bridwell's two-volume abbreviation of it, which is 1,200 pages. And what Toynbee says is that civilizations rise and fall depending on a dynamic of challenge and response. They're all challenged in some way. And they either respond effectively and they rise and they endure and they live on into history, or they fail to meet their challenges and they fall onto the ash heap of history. He starts way back with ancient Egyptian civilization on the Nile and with the Inca civilization in Latin America, in the mountains of Latin America, what is now Peru. And the challenge he said they faced was an environmental challenge. Hostile environment, in the case of Egypt, arid lands. Could they actually establish an agricultural economy that would sustain human civilization and communities, large communities, that could live together? Well, we know they did that. We don't have the evidence of how they lived, but they left behind these magnificent temples in Machu Picchu and all the temples up and down the Nile and the pyramids, so they had enough excess wealth that they had generated to be able to build those pyramids that have lasted for centuries. But they fell to another challenge, which is the challenge of an external invader. An invader that was militarily more powerful and more modern. In the case of the Egyptians, it was the Ottoman Turks. In the case of the Peruvians, the Incas, it was the Spaniards. Now, what's interesting is that's a challenge we know something about. We've met and we've defeated it. We met it and defeated it, and actually in our own revolution in a way, but certainly we did during World War II with Hitler and the Axis powers. We did it again facing the Soviet Union in the long 50 years of the Cold War in the second half of the 20th century. But what's interesting to me is that when Toynbee gets to the civilizations that we admire the most, ancient Greece and ancient Rome, they fell victim to another challenge. It's a challenge that Toynbee calls schisms in the soul. Schisms in the soul of the society. Schisms in the body politic. Schisms, divisions, internal conflicts within the society, which is what he concludes in the end brought down ancient Greece and brought down ancient Rome. Well, when I read that and I thought about that, I read that back then, I didn't think about it now, but when I thought back about it as I was working on my book, Who Stole the American Dream, I said, my God, that's where we are. Our challenge today, we're going to have to deal with terrorism. We're going to have to deal with North Korea's nuclear weapon. But our biggest challenge is inside our country. Our biggest challenge is whether or not we can actually have our political system work, whether or not we can begin to address this enormous problem of economic inequality, whether or not we can address climate change, whether or not we can address how to deal with the entitlement program, Social Security and Medicare, and make sure that they last on for the next generations, education, you name it, whatever the issue is. You know, for the last several years, we haven't really addressed effectively any of those issues. We can't even pass a budget. I know you're going to get a lot of hallelujahs this week because we're passing a continuing resolution. Do you know what a continuing resolution is? It's basically a resolution that says we can't agree on what to do, so we're just going to continue to do what we have been doing with a couple of tweaks here and there. I can tell you when I first went to Washington as a reporter for the New York Times in the early 60s and on through the 70s and 80s, the Republicans and the Democrats fought. And Richard Nixon and Lyndon Johnson were totally different people. And so they passed budgets every year. They passed programs to send people to the moon. They built national highway programs. They passed Medicare and Medicaid. They did a whole lot of legislation. We got a little bit of it in Obama's first 2 years. He did better than most by passing the things that he did. But since then, and what's interesting, we're having a new president with the same party. We're looking at party labels controlling all three centers of power, the House, the Senate, and the White House. And he's running into the same kind of problems that we had when Obama was president, facing an opposition party. I'm going to get to why in a moment. But think about that. So we're not getting things done. And when we think about the political system, we either want to laugh about it or we want to cry about it. The laughter is, for me, is that famous old Peanuts cartoon, the one where Lucy has a card table set up in the backyard. It says, psychiatry 1 cent. Well, you know who comes up. Charlie Brown comes up, puts his penny down. And Lucy says to Charlie, you know, Charlie, before I can give you any advice, you have to think of life as a voyage on a great ocean liner. Some people take their deck chair to the bow, and they look into the future to see where they're going. And other people take their deck chair to the stern and they look into the past to see where they've come from. Which group do you belong to? And Charlie scratches his head. He said, Lucy, I'm having trouble getting my chair unfolded. So that's the laughter side. But the other side is, we don't think the government works for us anymore. We don't feel connected to it. We see it swamped by money. We see it singing to the tune of special interests. We sense that Wall Street and big business has captured the capital. We have a sense, maybe not so much in this state, but in lots of states, a sense that politicians have rigged their home districts so they've got a guaranteed re-election, and the only thing we can do is term limit them to get them out of there. We have this sense of being excluded. If you ask people what they think about the political system, in poll after poll after poll, 70 to 80% of people will say it's broken. Public confidence, poll that interests me is the question of public confidence in the political system. If you ask people about their opinion of, before he got near retirement, Obama, but certainly now Trump and Congress and Republicans and Democrats and lawyers and the media and everybody else, we're all way down there at rock bottom. But the poll that really matters to me is public confidence in the political system is at its lowest point in 40 years. People don't believe the system is working for them anymore. We have government of and by the politicians and the parties and the special interests for government of the special interests, the parties, and the politicians, instead of government of, by, and for the people. We're a long way away. That's what I meant at the outside when I said our democracy is in trouble. It's in deep trouble. And the question is, two questions. How did it get this way? And is there anything we can do about it? Well, this trouble built over a long period of time, but 2010 was a watershed year. 2010 was a year in which two really big things happened to our political system. The first was a decision by the Supreme Court in the Citizens United case that corporations and unions could spend unlimited money from their own treasuries, which had previously been forbidden. Now, most people don't know it, but there was actually a law passed in 1907. 1907? Under Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft in that era, that corporate money couldn't go into politics. So as part of the progressive era, they were already addressing a problem that is now aching our society today. Citizens United knocked that out. And what's happened in the money system is just impossible to believe. Let's just take dark money. You hear a lot about dark money. Dark money just means it's money that we know is spent because people have to file some report on what is spent. But it is covered under such an umbrella name that we can't figure out who actually gave the money. We can't tell who is the piper that's calling the tune. We can't see it. In 2006, the amount of dark money in American politics was $5.2 million. In 2012, it was $300 million. That's what happened after Citizens United. In 2016, it was well over $500 million. Each election is going up. The cost of the elections went up. 2012, 2016, we now have elections that cost now $6-7 billion. And by the way, from the standpoint of major funders, corporations, special interests, Koch brothers, you name it, putting $100 million into an election is cheap because you're going to wind up by getting laws written for you that are going to wind up by saving you billions. There's a high multiplier effect on what happens. And by the way, people say government doesn't work. Government works. It works for the people who pay for it to work for them. Okay? We don't like that. We're upset about that. That happened in 2010. The other thing that happened in 2010, people don't know much about, and it hasn't been explained very well by the media, and people haven't focused on. In 2010, something happened called Red Map. Red Map was a Republican program to try to capture control of as many state legislatures across the country, so that after the 2010 census and the reapportionment of congressional seats all across the country, that they would be in control of more legislatures and would be able to draw the maps for the political districts for Congress. And they did extremely well. The Democrats were paying no attention to this. It only cost $30 million. In terms of American politics, the $30 million the Republicans invested in state elections and very carefully targeted individual state elections around the country. And in probably 10 or 11 key states, was not terribly expensive. It cost them $30 million. But when they finished, Republicans controlled the legislature and the governor's chair in states that controlled 40% of the seats in Congress, and the Democrats 10%. And the other 50% had some kind of split control. Republicans went to work and they drew the lines. Now, you've probably heard from some people, it doesn't matter how the lines are drawn. The way the vote goes is really determined by the fact that liberals and Democrats and whatnot, minorities particularly, live in the cities, and conservatives and Republicans tend to live in the countryside. And so it's what somebody wrote back in 2008, a very good book called The Big Sort. We just sorted ourselves out, and that's the way the cookie crumbles. Not true. Not true. Now, let me just take one state for you, state of Pennsylvania. In Pennsylvania, in 2010, the vote between the Republicans and the Democrats was pretty even. And so was the congressional delegation. It was about 9-9. They had 18 seats. In 2012, the vote was pretty even, but the Democrats had an edge, slightly more votes than the Republicans. But the Republicans had done the gerrymandering in Pennsylvania in 2011. And they got 13 seats, and the Democrats got 5. Now, this is not just done by the Republicans. The Democrats do it in Massachusetts, and they do it in Illinois. They do it in my former home state of Maryland. They do it in other states as well. It's just the Republicans were one hell of a lot smarter and a hell of a lot better about it. And the modern computer technology has made it so sophisticated that they can arrange districts extremely well by packing their opponents in a few districts and spreading out their own strength in many. And what happened across the country in 2012 was that the Democrats actually carried the vote for Congress by 1.5 million votes. They got 1.5 million more votes for seats in the House of Congress in 2012 than Republicans, but Republicans got a 33-seat majority in the House of Representatives. Now, what's interesting about today's politics and about the way the government works is that the gerrymandering of districts around the country helped create what is called the Freedom Caucus, which you've probably heard of recently, because the Freedom Caucus and another dozen or so congressmen in the Republican backbenches who sit around and coalesce with them prevented the passage, and maybe they're going to go along with it, they prevented the passage of the repeal of Obamacare against Donald Trump. What you need to know is they're also the same people who blocked all kinds of legislation that Obama wanted, voted on, and they shut down the government several times under Obama. And they're also the same people who knocked off John Boehner and deposed him. Those people, all but 2 of them, come from absolute gerrymander-protected districts, and so when the polls say the public doesn't like what's going on, when the rest of Congress is unhappy about it, these people are insulated from public opinion by gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is directly affecting all kinds of political decisions. When the Senate under Obama passed an immigration reform bill, the House Republican leadership couldn't even bring it to a vote in the House because this block of gerrymander-protected Republicans wouldn't let it come to a vote. This is what gerrymander is doing, not just to this president, but to the dysfunctionality of our political system. So these 2 things, money and gerrymandering, have come together, and they've absolutely caused our political system both to be unrepresentative and with dark money to be non-transparent and not to be fair and not to be workable. Now our next question is there anything we can do about it? The great news is yes, and the great news is it's already happening. The problem is, the bad news is, The press isn't telling you the good news. The good news is that not only in Washington State, which has voted, along with several other states, to roll back Citizens United and call for a constitutional amendment to restore the power of Congress and the states to regulate campaign finance. And Seattle has passed an honest elections bill with a bit of public funding in it. And there are other efforts that have been underway here. There's a modified gerrymander reform at work, a bipartisan commission at work in Washington State. But beyond that, Connecticut has now for 5 election cycles had a system of public funding of campaigns for state elections, not for Congress, not for the Senate, but for governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, all the seats in the House of Representatives, for 5 cycles. And you know, 80% of the Republicans and Democrats who run voluntarily, who run for the legislature, voluntarily take part. And that every single candidate in the last gubernatorial race and for any statewide office, they took public funding. And what difference does it make? It means they have to raise some money to qualify, but it's a modest amount and they have to raise it in their home districts. What happens is campaigns suddenly get about candidates talking with voters, candidates talking about issues, public debates instead of people spending all their time dialing for dollars. What happens is in the legislature, you suddenly have people who couldn't afford to run for office, running for office. The number of blacks and Latinos in the Connecticut legislature has tripled since this system went into effect. People from the inner city of Bridgeport and New Haven and Hartford who couldn't run because there wasn't enough money in their political districts to be able to run, and where candidates used to depend on their party leadership to get the money from PACs and lobbyists and contractors for state contracts. Now it's done at the local level. And when they get into the legislature, they can actually pass and act on legislation that used to be bottled up by lobbyists. Lobbyists, like everybody else, they can't give any more than $100. Average person can give anywhere from $5 to $100, no more. No corporate contributions, no PAC contributions directly to the candidates. They have to go to the parties. The parties can help out the candidates a little bit. It has changed the political climate in Connecticut. It operates there. There are 3 or 4 states, Maine, Connecticut, Minnesota, and Arizona, all have robust public funding programs going on statewide. And I noticed in 2016 you made an effort in Washington State to take the Seattle idea of democracy voucher statewide, and it didn't pass. So it's a big issue that happens. They've done that in Connecticut. In Florida, not exactly one of the states that you would figure would be in the front of reform in America. In Florida, they have enacted the boldest, strongest, clearest gerrymander reform in the country. The voters in Florida in 2010, the very same year that Citizens United came out, the very same year that Red Map went into effect, the very same year that Florida elected a Republican governor and a Republican legislature, 62.5% of the voters in Florida voted for a plan that said you cannot redistrict. You cannot draw the lines of the election districts in this state with, quote, the intent to favor one political party over the other, unquote, or to keep incumbents in office. Right clear. Guess what? Republican legislators said, fine, it's a great thing, we're going to do it, it's going to be the best redistricting that's ever happened in the state of Florida. Total lie. They went engaged in a conspiracy. They did an underground gerrymander. It took the League of Women Voters and Common Cause and Fair Districts Florida 3 years arguing in the court until they got a decision from the Florida Supreme Court that this was a blatantly unconstitutional gerrymander in Florida. And the state of Florida and the legislature had to reshape 8 congressional districts. If you have to do 8 out of 27, you wind up by having to do about 15. And they totally shook up the state congressional delegation. And they said you have to redraw the lines for the entire state Senate, 40 different districts. This last election, 2016, was the first held under that new court order redrawing of the maps, and the congressional delegation in Florida began to change. It's probably going to take another couple of cycles to do it in an extensive way. But the point was the people in Florida were able to do that. In Washington State, you've put in an absolute model program, the top 2 primary. What a genius idea. What we've had in America over the last 30 years is the gradual separation of the political parties. Political scientists used to chart the votes of members of Congress like Rorschach, and they overlapped. The liberal Republicans overlap with the conservative Democrats. And over the last 30 years, they've opened apart, and there's a no man's land between them. We have no middle. You can't govern in Washington if both parties are at the end zones. You got to get somebody out in the middle of the field to play with each other, to make the compromises that make democracy work. So when you get a top two primary that forces everybody to run in the same primary and all the politicians to try to appeal across the board, you start to get moderate opinion. And I don't know if you know it, but people who have studied the congressional vote patterns have told me that in the current Washington state delegation, the party lineup may be the same as it was 10 years ago, but none of the members of your delegation are in the outer 20% of either party. They are all playing somewhere between the 20-yard lines and the middle of the field. That's a huge change. If we had that happen in 10 states, Congress would start to behave differently. If we had gerrymander reform and top two primaries, tremendous difference. We have disclosure laws that are really powerful and important in California, in Massachusetts, in other states. 25 of the American states are now engaged in some form of effort to change partisan gerrymandering. They're either lawsuits, they're citizens' movements, or they're changes like the ones that have been done in Washington state. I need to see where we are in time. I was going to show you a film of South Dakota, because I went to South Dakota last fall with Kevin Neely, my cameraman, who's sitting right down here. South Dakota, an unbelievably red state. Why are we going there to cover political reform? They had on the ballot in South Dakota last fall a nonpartisan primary like the one that you have here in Washington state, a constitutional amendment, a public funding bill, and a gerrymander reform bill. They had everything. It's a red state. You think nothing is going to happen. Public funding passed in South Dakota, 52% of the vote. It failed here in Washington state. It happened in South Dakota. Now the legislatures come back, dominated 80% Republican, just killed it because they don't want anybody challenging them. Start giving public money around, my God, the challenges might actually beat us. We might actually have a competitive election. They don't want that. The reformers are going back. If we have time later on, I'll show you this film. It's really amazing just simply to see this going on in a state like South Dakota. The point I want to leave with you is this. Our democracy is in danger. There's no way we can get Washington to fix it. The people in Washington don't want to fix it. They got there through the system that is corrupted by money and dominated by gerrymandering. They like it the way it is. If we don't like it, it's up to us to change it. And the place to change it is right here, ground zero. Seattle, Washington, Portland, Oregon, all across these states, and all across South Dakota, Connecticut, Maine. You won't believe it. Arizona has got an independent commission doing redistricting instead of legislative gerrymandering. There are states that you wouldn't believe are on the map trying to do something. There is hope. There is a way to do this. We can do this, but we have to believe it, and we have to exercise the power we have as we the people. Thanks.